By the time someone says they're leaving, the decision was often made weeks, sometimes months earlier. Relationship exits are rarely impulsive. They don't happen in a single moment of anger or disappointment. They happen gradually, internally, through a series of quiet recalibrations where someone begins to imagine life without you and slowly starts building toward that reality. What makes this so difficult to recognize is that the person isn't necessarily behaving badly. They're not hostile. They're not cruel. They're simply withdrawing investment, reorganizing their emotional and practical world in ways that reduce dependence on you, preparing themselves, consciously or unconsciously, for a future that no longer includes the relationship. And while they're doing this, you may not notice anything dramatic. There's no heated argument, no obvious betrayal, just small shifts, subtle changes in how they structure their time, who they confide in, how much access you have to their inner world. These shifts are behavioral preparation, the quiet groundwork that happens before someone announces they're done. And understanding what that preparation looks like is crucial, not so you can panic or force confrontation, but so you can see clearly what's actually happening instead of operating in confusion. Today, we're going to examine 5 specific signs that someone is quietly removing you from their life, not emotional coldness, not loss of affection, but structural detachment, the kind that signals they've already started mentally separating and are now adjusting their behavior to match that internal decision. Awareness here isn't about control, it's about clarity. So you're not blindsided, so you can address what's happening or at least understand it with dignity. Before examining the specific signs, it helps to understand the psychology of how people disengage before leaving. When someone decides, at whatever level of consciousness, that a relationship is no longer sustainable, they begin a process called cognitive disengagement. This is where they mentally separate themselves from the partnership. They stop thinking in terms of we and start thinking in terms of I. They stop planning a shared future and start imagining an independent one. This cognitive shift often happens long before any outward conversation, and once it begins, behavior follows. Because thinking of yourself as separate naturally leads to acting separately, making plans without consultation, building emotional support outside the relationship, reducing the amount of yourself you share. Another key concept is emotional unpairing. This is the gradual withdrawal of emotional investment, where someone stops caring as deeply about the relationship's health, stops prioritizing your perspective, stops feeling anxious about potential conflict or distance, because they've already detached enough that those things no longer feel urgent. There's also mental rehearsal of independence. People preparing to leave often begin imagining what life will look like afterward, how they'll structure their time, who they'll rely on, what their routines will be. And that rehearsal becomes visible in their behavior. They start living as if they're already single, even while still technically in the relationship. All of this happens quietly, not out of deception, but because internal decisions often precede external ones. And by the time the conversation happens, they've already done the emotional and practical work of separating. Understanding this process helps you recognize it when it's happening, not to stop it, because once cognitive disengagement begins, it's rarely reversible, but to see it clearly instead of operating in denial. If this resonates, subscribe to Femme Psychology with Emma. We explore relationship psychology with clarity, not drama. Sign 1. She reorganizes her life without you. When someone is preparing to exit a relationship, one of the first behavioral shifts is the reorganization of their life in ways that no longer include you. This doesn't mean they're openly excluding you, but their routines, their plans, their schedule, they start to operate independently. Where once there was natural coordination, now there's separation. Where shared time used to be assumed, now it's optional or infrequent. What's happening psychologically is that they're testing independence, seeing what it feels like to structure their days without factoring you in. And the more comfortable that independence becomes, the less motivated they are to reintegrate you into their plans. Think about what this looks like in practice. She used to check with you before committing to weekend plans. Now she makes them without mentioning it. Not because she's hiding anything, but because she's stopped thinking of your shared time as default. Or she used to coordinate her schedule with yours, making sure evenings aligned, that travel plans didn't conflict. But now her calendar is structured entirely around her own priorities. You find out about trips or commitments after they've already been decided. There's also a shift in daily routines. Maybe she used to text you throughout the day, small check-ins, sharing thoughts, staying connected. But now those messages have stopped. Not because she's angry, but because she's no longer oriented toward maintaining that thread of connection. What makes this structural rather than emotional is that it's not about mood, it's about logistics. She's building a life that functions without your participation, and once that structure is in place, leaving becomes easier because the practical framework for independence already exists. When you notice this shift, when shared planning becomes rare and her life starts operating on a completely separate track, it's often a sign that she's already begun the process of removing you from her daily reality. Sign 2, she stops seeking your input. Another clear indicator of pre-exit detachment is when someone stops seeking your perspective on decisions that would normally involve both of you. In healthy partnerships, input flows naturally. Not because one person controls the other, but because both value each other's perspective. Decisions, large and small, are discussed. Not always formally, but at least acknowledged. There's a sense of, we're in this together, so your thoughts matter. But when someone is disengaging, that stops. They make decisions unilaterally, not necessarily out of disrespect, but because they've already mentally separated. Your perspective no longer feels relevant because they're operating as an individual, rather than as part of a partnership. This shows up in various ways. She makes financial decisions without mentioning them. She accepts job opportunities or commitments that affect both of you without discussing it first. She rearranges shared spaces or plans without checking in. And when you notice and bring it up, the response is often vague. I didn't think it was a big deal. Or, I'm used to making my own decisions. What's really happening is that she's stopped thinking of the relationship as a collaborative system. Her life is hers, and what you think about her choices no longer factors into her decision-making process. There's also a reduction in emotional check-ins. She used to ask how you felt about things, not just logistics, but deeper questions. Your take on something happening in her life, your perspective on a challenge she was facing, but now those questions have stopped. Not because she doesn't care about you as a person, but because she's no longer emotionally invested in your input shaping her direction. What this signals psychologically is autonomy reclamation. She's reestablishing herself as independent. And that reclamation, while sometimes healthy in moderation, becomes a clear sign of exit preparation when it's total and sustained. When your perspective is no longer sought, when decisions happen without you and it's treated as normal, it's often because she's already operating from a place where you're no longer central to her life. Sign 3. She builds emotional support elsewhere. When someone is preparing to leave, they often begin redistributing their emotional investment. Instead of relying on you for support, perspective, or connection, they turn to friends, family, or other sources. This isn't necessarily about replacing you romantically. It's about creating an emotional infrastructure that no longer depends on the relationship, so that when the exit happens, they're not left isolated. They've already built a support network that can absorb the transition. You'll notice this in how she talks about her life. where she used to share challenges, frustrations, or thoughts with you first, now you hear about them secondhand, or not at all. She's already processed things with her friends. By the time you're aware, the issue is resolved or no longer relevant. There's also a subtle narrative shift in how she talks about the relationship to others. She's no longer framing it positively. She's not defending it when friends express concern. She's not talking about future plans together. Instead, she's quietly planting seeds of separation, mentioning difficulties, expressing doubts, preparing the people around her for the eventual announcement. This matters because emotional preparation of others is a form of exit rehearsal. She's testing how it feels to position herself as separate, and if the people she confides in respond supportively to that framing, it reinforces her internal decision. What makes this structural rather than just emotional distance is that it's deliberate. She's not just venting to friends, she's building a post-relationship identity, strengthening bonds that will matter more once you're no longer part of her daily life. When you notice that she's become significantly more connected to others while simultaneously more distant from you, when her emotional world has clearly shifted away from the relationship, it's often a sign that she's already begun the mental and social work of separating. Sign 4. She minimizes physical and emotional access. Another structural shift that happens before someone exits is the reduction of access, not just emotional intimacy, but practical availability. Time together becomes limited. Spontaneity disappears. Interactions become controlled and brief. This happens because maintaining closeness requires energy, and when someone is preparing to leave, they conserve that energy. They stop investing in moments that deepen connection because deepening connection works against their internal decision. You'll see this in how time together is structured. Where interactions used to be open-ended, sitting together for hours, talking without agenda, now they're time-boxed. She's available for dinner, but only until a certain point. She'll spend time with you, but there's always something else she needs to do afterward. There's also a reduction in spontaneous communication. She used to call or text just to share something, a thought, a moment, a connection. But now communication is functional, logistics, necessary information, nothing more. And physical closeness, not just sexual but casual touch, proximity, warmth, becomes noticeably reduced. She's not affectionate in the ways she used to be. Not because she's angry, but because maintaining physical closeness creates emotional attachment, and she's trying to detach. What this looks like emotionally is controlled engagement. She shows up when necessary. She's polite, pleasant even, but there's a boundary now that didn't exist before, a sense that you only have access to certain parts of her. The rest is closed off. This minimization of access serves a specific psychological function. It reduces the pain of leaving. The less connected she feels in the present, the easier it becomes to imagine being fully disconnected in the future. When time together feels increasingly limited and controlled, when spontaneity has disappeared, and when physical and emotional warmth have been noticeably withdrawn, it's often because she's already begun the process of creating distance that will make the final separation less jarring. Sign 5. She becomes calm about losing you. Most important. The fifth and most telling sign is emotional neutrality about the possibility of losing the relationship. When someone is still invested, the idea of separation creates anxiety, fear, urgency. They care enough that the prospect of ending things feels destabilizing. But when someone has already emotionally disengaged, that fear disappears. They're not panicked. They're not trying to fix things. They're calm, almost indifferent. This is the psychological shift from attachment to detachment, and it's one of the clearest indicators that the internal decision to leave has already been made. You'll notice this in how she responds to relational tension. In the past, conflict would create visible distress. She'd want to resolve it, talk it through, make sure things were okay. But now, when issues arise, she's unbothered. She doesn't push for resolution. She doesn't seem anxious about unresolved tension. She just moves on. There's also no visible fear of distance. Where pulling away from each other used to create discomfort for both of you, now she seems fine with it. She doesn't reach out to reconnect. She doesn't express concern when you don't communicate as much. She's comfortable with the gap. And perhaps most telling, she doesn't react emotionally when you bring up problems in the relationship. She's not defensive. She's not upset. She's calm, almost detached, as if the relationship's health is no longer something she's emotionally invested in protecting. What this reveals is that she's already mourned the relationship internally. She's already done the emotional work of letting go. And now, the outward structure is just catching up to the internal reality. When someone becomes calm about losing you, when there's no urgency, no fear, no visible effort to hold things together, it's often because they've already decided. And what remains is just the timing of when they'll say it out loud. Recognizing these signs doesn't mean immediate action is required. It means awareness. People can exhibit some of these behaviors temporarily, pulling back during stress, needing space, reorganizing priorities. Isolated incidents don't define trajectories. But when multiple signs appear together and persist over time, they form a pattern. And patterns reveal truth. The mature response is observation without overreaction. Addressing what you've noticed calmly. Creating space for honest conversation about where things actually stand. Not accusing, not demanding. Just expressing what you've observed and asking if she's still invested in the relationship. Sometimes that conversation reveals temporary withdrawal that can be addressed. But often it confirms what the behavior already told you, that she's made an internal decision and is now structuring her life accordingly. Either way, clarity is better than denial. Because operating in confusion, trying to hold together something that's already been let go on the other side, only prolongs pain. Most exits are not dramatic. They are deliberate. By the time someone announces they're leaving, the preparation has already happened. The routines have been restructured. The emotional support has been redistributed. The access has been minimized. The internal decision has been made and mourned. What remains is just the formality of saying it. Understanding this doesn't give you control over the outcome, but it does give you clarity. And clarity, even when it's uncomfortable, allows you to respond with dignity rather than confusion. So if you've noticed these signs, if the structure of her life has quietly shifted away from you, it's worth addressing directly. Not to force her to stay, but to understand where you actually stand. Because staying in ambiguity, hoping things will shift back, only delays the inevitable. And at this stage of life, your time and peace are too valuable to waste on relationships that have already ended in one person's mind. Have you ever noticed these kinds of subtle exit behaviors? Drop a comment with your thoughts. And subscribe to Femme Psychology with Emma for more depth on relationship dynamics that most people never talk about openly.